Best horror game, is it?
We have returned to determine yet another
Best horror game, Returnal.
Best horror game of 2020. Hit me with your nominations.
Chores.
That's not even out yet.
So much for the personal.
My dogs have opinions.
Wow, they feel strongly about it.
Okay.
I want to hear from TJ because his argument has intrigued me all week.
So, this is going to be an interesting one because there is... Okay, so my nomination here was Amnesia Rebirth. And the very distinct reason why I chose Amnesia Rebirth stems from an issue I have with horror games in general, is that 95% of horror games, in my opinion, give you too much power. Like the means that developers go to like sort of balance out the suspense, and usually ends up in a state where by the end of the game they just straight up give you a super weapon to blow up the big bad with. And that is a ongoing and common problem in the horror game genre that has existed. It isn't defined by this generation. It's been going on, I would say, heck, probably as far back as Splatterhouse. It's just the fact of the matter that when developers want to give power back to players, they generally end up giving it in a way that can be manipulated into a point where the horror game is not a horror game anymore. It's an action game that with a horror theme to it. Amnesia Rebirth to me doesn't do that. The threat is sustained throughout the game in the way that you don't really feel confident to fight off or fend off whatever's coming next. You have very limited equipment, you have very limited means to deal with threats, and you have and even finding the little pieces that allow you to defend yourself is like, you have to be very careful and methodical about it. Because, okay, like darkness is one of the huge elements of health deterioration in that game. Sanity is a huge part of that game, and being in the dark makes you more frightened. And so, like, the main way you fend off the darkness is with either a lamp with limited fuel or matches, which literally last 3 to 5 seconds before they die out. You got to get another match, and like it like utilizes mechanics that I think are a genius extension of giving a little bit of power to the player. At the risk of spoiling, I am going to spoil one thing in this game. At one point, you as a female character discover that you are pregnant. And it adds so much intensity to the rest of the narrative. Because not only are you fighting for this character to survive for herself because she needs to make it out, because she's trying to make it out alive, but her need to protect her child and survive with that baby becomes also a part of that narrative. And it becomes a mechanical thing too, because when she's frightened, when like your sanity is slipping, there's actually a button to check on your baby, observe and speak to it, and she's comforted by it, and it eases her sanity a bit. And that is like the amount of things that they do to make it to make this horror game, to make you feel powerless as the player in this world of horrible things, but also give you the means to like push forward. Is Amnesia hits every single notch for what I think a true and compelling horror game really ought to be.
That same argument is what made Alien Isolation so fantastic.
And at the end, you get a flamethrower, which kind of plays to TJ's point, right? Like, the alien's not scary anymore because you just burninate it.
The alien is terrifying in that game.
Yeah.
But until you get the, I mean, it's still scary when you get the flamethrower, but his whole point, and this is what Frictional did. Like, I love Frictional's games. You go back to Penumbra, the reason Amnesia is scarier than any of the Penumbra trilogies for me, because in Penumbra, you can fight back. I remember in the first one, you drop down the shaft into the cave, the dogs come out. I actually found a way to, like, stand on a rock so that the dogs wouldn't bite me. And I had another rock, I would throw it at the snout of the closest dog. The rock would bounce back, I'd pick it up and just do it again. And I did that until the dogs were dead. But the Amnesia games, like, you can't fight back. Hell, to TJ's point, what I love about the Dark Descent, the original, was that instead of fight or flight, they just cut out fight. And so you hide in the dark from the monster, but when you're in the dark, your sanity ebbs, right? So it's like, even by being safe, you're still kind of hurting yourself. You just have to decide what the risk and reward is. That's actually, TJ, you're further in that game than I am. So when you check on your child, what is the visual of that? Like, do you put a hand on your belly and kind of look down?
She looks down at her. She looks down at her belly. She puts her hands over it. She speaks to it, and you can hear the heartbeat of the baby. Like, and the heartbeat is like, sometimes it's very fast and intense, and as that mechanic goes on, it slows down little by little.
So does it? So you know how in games like Halo with rechargeable armor and or health, you can just find a place to hide, wait for your meters to recharge, and then you're good to go. Would you say in this game, is that method of soothing kind of like, hey, if I hide and just stare at my belly for a while, I'll be a-okay? Or can it only like rejuvenate you and fortify you so much?
It can only do it so much. You can still be if you hide in the dark for too long, you'll still lose your sanity. And moreover, like, for lack of better terms, there are monsters throughout the Amnesia series as a whole that react to insanity, and when you become more insane, they can zero in on you easier.
Yeah, that's really cool. I really like that. One thing I asked you about is that, you know, in the Dark Descent, which is kind of my touchstone here, because I think that might be the greatest survival horror ever made. But, you know, what I have coming for me in Rebirth, according to you, sounds like that might overtake it. But what I like is that the character didn't speak that much. He was still kind of a vehicle for me. And I didn't know if I liked the idea of a talking protagonist in this one, because sometimes like talking is a good way to like have a character speak your feelings or connect you to them. But if the talking is expository, then I kind of get annoyed with the character because they're treating me like I'm dumb. Like, how do you feel that Rebirth handles that?
It makes sense in the way that she responds to responds thoughtfully to the discovery of things she finds, like finding corpses, reading notes, and discovering certain clues, talking to the baby and responding to the baby and checking on the baby throughout the game. Responding to the loss of certain characters that came much earlier in the game. Like, her as a vehicle doesn't bother me as much as it would in like other games like that, because her narrative and her journey and her responses to it felt like things that I would be saying to myself if I was in that place.
That's a mark of pretty sharp writing, I would say. Yeah. Okay.
Like, she's not like coming up on a dead body and being like, oh, that's a dead body. I see it. It's there. This is a dead body for sure. It's like, what happened here and why?
Yeah. She's like a dead body. Someone died here, you know? Like,
well, it's also because she's like an average person, right? She's not like a detective or like a superhero, right? She's just like a person that plays into that.
She's literally an architectural artist. That's all she is. And like it's it's a like in my opinion, it's a powerful narrative. And it keeps like from the context of you are on a and this is like in the first 5 minutes, you're on a plane with people that are traveling the Algeria desert. That plane crashes, and you go and you just start heading on to not only survive but also figure out where is everybody else that you crashed with. It's a pretty strong narrative of discovery and fear throughout.
I think my last concern, which did bother me until I stopped playing, was that basically in a nutshell, visual diversity. You know, in the Dark Descent, yes, you're in a Dark Ages type castle, but there are pretty diverse environments like the sewers where the water monster stalks you, and then you come out of there into this big open chamber with a lot of blue light, and then in the next area where the monster stalks you, there's a lot of yellow lighting to kind of just unsettling. My concern is in Rebirth, is it just a lot of like sand and brown, or does it spice things up a lot?
It comes within a razor's edge of jumping the shark.
Oh.
like if you don't know what I'm talking about, like I implore you, go further, because
Okay.
it goes wackadoo.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a solid case. I love this franchise, so I'm gonna get back to Rebirth, I think.
In terms of, I mean, you touched on it a little bit, TJ, but like I'm watching some gameplay of it right now. Like, what are the mechanics in it? So obviously there's light mechanics, and you can hide. Like, what are the other some? Because it seems like I'm not saying this is what it is. I'm just saying right now from what I'm looking, it's just a lot of long corridors where you hide, and a lot of long corridors and you hide. Is that what the game generally is, or is it more than that?
There's also a lot more of discovery, because as I mentioned, you're trying to figure out what happened to your crewmates, and so you can actually like pick up pretty much most individual objects in the environment and move them around. And to that end, often it's so that you can discover like more matches or more fuel for your lantern, but also clues to figure out like journals, pictures, drawings, little breadcrumbs that piece together the story. It is as much of a like mystery game as I think a horror game. Oh, David, you're muted.
Sorry, I didn't want to. I was looking at gameplay and stuff too. Didn't want to hear the keyboard and everything. Yeah, Greg, to speak to Amnesia in general, and TJ can probably expand on this, but one thing I've really liked about this franchise is it's really great to play with a keyboard and mouse because of how natural actions feel. Like, for example, to open a door, you click on the knob and then you'll drag the mouse back to open it, or push the mouse forward to open it that way. It got to the point where it felt so natural that there were points in that game where, like, I walked into a room with a well, so I was curious, how deep is this? So I reached down, picked up a pebble and dropped it, and then just looked over and listened. Like, I don't know if Rebirth is that dynamic, but I imagine it, it probably would have to be. Yeah, like, that stuff is really cool. Like, interacting feels very natural and organic.
The sound design in this game is top notch. Like, for like many of the reasons that we loved Resident Evil 2, like hearing Mr. X through the walls, you like pay attention that much more to what you hear in terms of like footsteps and like doors opening. That's the same that can be said of this game. Like, you pay attention to the environment that much more because of how authentic and just like immersive the sound design is.
Yeah, that's cool. Does anybody want to nominate anything else? Josh, I don't know if you want to. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but do you think it's worth speaking to The Last of Us 2 as a horror game?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I could think of more than a few instances in the game where it hits some of the same notes of that horror experience that TJ was talking about with Amnesia, Rebirth, and excels at those just as well as games that focus more on it, like Amnesia, Rebirth do. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely more of an action-y game than anything, but I definitely think it fits the horror bill because of the environments and the way that the game pushes you into these kind of claustrophobic sequences that kind of amplify that fear of the infection and of death. Like, I mean, obviously, like throughout most of the game, you're playing as Ellie, and anyone that's played The Last of Us knows that Ellie is immune. She's immune to the virus, so getting bit doesn't really mean a whole lot. But throughout more of the game, you play as a different character, and I'm not going to say who because I'm not going to spoil it, because I know there's a lot of people out there that probably still haven't played it because they're just, you know, high on their horse of we're not going to play it because Naughty Dog screwed us or whatever, and that's fine. You're more than welcome to feel
they might
that
be
way.
waiting for a sale, Josh. You don't know.
Or they might be waiting for a sale. Yeah, you never know. But when you're playing as this other character is not immune. So the threat of the infection becomes a lot clearer, similar to how it was in the first game. And I think that there are these points, like there's this one point where you're going through this hotel, and before you get to this hotel, I think that this is just a great example of how a game could be like a horror game without just expressly focusing on dark corridors and, like, you know, creepy stuff. You're traveling across this makeshift bridge between these two skyscrapers, and for anyone that has a fear of heights, like, this is probably the equivalent of the most horrific horror game there is, because the way that Naughty Dog has designed this sequence, the wind is pushing against your character. You can feel it in your movements, like as you try to push forward, like you can just feel it pushing against you. The fear that the character itself has of heights is extremely apparent in the dialogue, the way that they're carrying themselves, and just the way the entire thing plays out really does well to build off of that fear factor. And then immediately following that, you're put into probably one of the scariest portions of the game, which is this old decrepit hotel that you have to travel through. And you don't know what's out there. I mean, you know about the different enemies, but you don't really know what's there. You hear sounds, you can go in guns blazing, but if you do, you're going to be overrun. You know, you have to worry about being bit now. You have to worry about your gas mask breaking. And it kind of captures on that same claustrophobic fear and horror that I think the Metro games did so well. And I think it's those sequences, while they're not always there, I think that they do enough to at least justify the game being in this nomination. Do I think it's the best horror game of the year? No. As much as I love it, I just don't think that it outweighs what games like Amnesia Rebirth have to offer, but I think that it touches on them enough without being just a distinctly horror experience.
Yeah, I think one thing the Last of Us games do particularly well concerning horror is because these aren't traditional role-playing games where you choose an action, you have to do what the game wants you to do, such as, you know, the ending of the first game and what Joel does to save Ellie. You're kind of horrified by the action this character is taking, but that you're forced to take to push the narrative forward. And one theme I think The Last of Us 2 does very well is vengeance and the cycle of vengeance, and how difficult it can be to break that cycle. It's almost like the cycle of domestic violence and abuse in that way. And I love that, you know, whether you're playing Ellie or the other character who shall remain unnamed, you're forced to do these certain things in the names of vengeance, and also forced to confront the fact that both of these people are entitled to vengeance, but both would be so much better off if they could just move on. And it's pretty horrific to witness and also take part in that. The games make you feel complicit in a way that is stomach churning, I think.
I'd like to add in on Last of Us and start off saying I haven't played Amnesia, which it brings shame to me and the family. And I agree with everything that TJ said. I thought his argument was fantastic. And I'm not going to argue against any part of it, but I'd say I have been through big chunks of Last of Us 2. Haven't finished, so I guess I should qualify that. But to add on to what Hawkins said, it's a game where I don't think I've played any game, except for maybe something else from Naughty Dog, where I would say the direction is so incredibly strong. in the way camera movements are done, whether the player moves them or whether the camera itself kind of nudges you towards a certain thing, the way it sets up scenes, the way certain parts of the framing of the way things are shown. Just from a visual standpoint, it can be awe-inspiring, and then it moves into creepy parts just based on either subtle camera movement, small movement from a character, or whatever.
Sorry. Yeah.
Like you were speaking in another category about how you like the first game, but you prefer doing the infected parts versus the parts where the humans, you were fighting them. And I've had the exact opposite experience where I absolutely loathe the see through the walls and hear the clickers and all that stuff and slowly strangle them to whatever over and over. And I find that the human parts where they're hunting you down in these enclosed spaces brings a sense of dread that I found delightful, even though dread itself isn't that way. But just the tension that ramps up, the way it goes. And in Last of Us 2, like many classic horror movies, books, stories, or whatever, there's the standard horror stuff, zombies, whatever else to go, but a lot of times it's the people that are in these situations that are the true, just frightening shit. And like you mentioned, there are characters for various reasons that are pushed towards either by, in the name of vengeance or whatever else. You may not sympathize with them, their plight or whatever, and you can see them doing these horrible things. And a lot of times it's like seeing a train come to hit a car stuck on the track in slow motion, and you hate that it's going to happen, you don't want it to happen, you feel bad about it, but you still sit there and go through it. And it reminds me a lot of some of my favorite, I guess more thriller than horror movies, where even you get situations with just absolutely deplorable characters and people watching them go through this, the motions and the things that happen. The way it makes you feel when you go through is something that's crazy and enjoyable for me. And I can't think of any other games other than some recent stuff from Naughty Dog, this in particular, where the combination of the animations in the game, the facial capture for the characters, the voice work together, a lot of the writing, it feels more real, I guess, and it is easier for me to buy into, even, although I think this game has huge flaws or whatever, but I guess just kind of the sum of all these parts working together and stuff like this really makes it stand out for me against the group.
I think that's a good argument.
Well.
Yeah, I think that's a good argument. I mean, I generally feel the same way. Like, humans tend to be the real monsters. I guess I enjoyed the infected parts more because I dig the combination of stealth and horror. And you still have that a lot with the human parts. And I think the humans' AI is better. I think the whole point of the infected is that they're meant to be a little predictable and that they'll always respond the same way to what you do generally. That's why, to kind of expand on it, my favorite, I think what makes this a great horror game for me is, that like stomach clenching, sick feeling you get when you're watching these characters, especially Ellie and the other protagonists, just come closer and closer to events that are just going to ruin them, and knowing that you're powerless to stop it, and not just powerless, but you're an agent in making it happen, because there's no this isn't a choose your own adventure, right? Like, the narrative is going to happen, and it's going to make you press that button or do whatever to go through with it.
I did, like, all that conversation made me think of a couple other things that I really like about Amnesia. Is that, first off, there is a moment of seeing something early that slowly and sickeningly becomes more relevant as you go on in the game, and it produces a sense of dread as you wait, as like it becomes present. But I don't want to say any more because I don't want to spoil anything. But the other thing is the idea of that it does scripted horror very well, but there's also something that I really appreciate about, there's emergent horror in that game. And it comes from the light cycle. So matches and oil, I mentioned, are the light sources in that game. Oil is like the more like stable light source, but you can't light sconces on fire with it. And the whole point, and a big part of that game is like creating these safety points where, like, if things get bad, you can go back to that point. Do you know what messes that up? There's a wind element in that game, and what does wind do to matches? Also, wind can put out sconces, like put out the sconces that you made. And so there's a truly randomized horror element in that game where like you come up against a situation where wind is an element and it puts out a light source, and suddenly the safety tether that you've created is gone. And you have to make a decision as to, oh my God, do I move forward or do I go back? It's really great. Like, not just in that scripted sequence, but also like in like these emergent situations and the decisions that they force you to make.
I think it's on the list for nominations, but I think David will agree with me for nominating Resident Evil 3 because, as well as like, there's different types of horror, right? Like Amnesia is a very like narrowy, dark, what's around the corner, scary horror. And I gotta say, like Resident Evil 3 does horror especially different than 2. Like it opens the game in such an actiony way, but it's still terrifying. You're in your safe place at the apartment, and this giant mask thing has a garbage bag over his head with caution tape just bursts in and starts chasing you through the city. And then you open up the door to your apartment, and it's just chaos. And it's not the same type of horror as like Amnesia or like, oh my God, what's around the corner. It's holy shit, what is happening? And and then you just it carries you along this actiony terror path of you trying to avoid zombies getting to a helicopter, and then it just keeps going. It isn't I don't think it'll win horror because it's definitely not as scary as like Amnesia, like as TJ has been explaining, but I think it definitely deserves a nomination just because there are some scary points in that game, and for how actiony it is, it's still terrifying being chased by Nemesis with a flamethrower through a building, or trying to turn power on that section. I've just got to it, David, where you turn power on the grid, where you're getting chased by the spider creatures. That's terrifying.
That's the scariest. That, despite everything I've said about Amnesia Rebirth, that insect section is the scariest moment in any game I've played out of 2020. I hate that section.
Yeah, it's rough. I think that section is terrifying. I also was pretty bothered by the hospital section, as Carlos and as Jill. I think the audio design there is great. Like you can almost hear, I think it's supposed to be pipes creaking, but it sounds like some monster breathing. I think this game, I think RE3 Remake deserves a nomination, but it definitely doesn't deserve to win. I think this game has great horror moments. Especially the first time through. Like, you don't know when Nemesis is going to be there and when he's going to disappear for a while. But it's definitely not as pure of a horror game as last year's RE2 Remake. I don't even really hold that against it because the original RE3 wasn't a pure horror game either. Like, the series was always moving in one direction. Even RE2 had a lot more action than RE1. But it definitely has moments where it does that thing, horror, very, very well. And I enjoyed it. I think that a lot of people were turned off by much more action-heavy parts, such as the siege in the hospital, which I actually kind of enjoyed because I thought that was a good way to something I spoke about earlier of cooling down. You were just supposed to kind of... It's kind of like one thing Hyrule Warriors does well is in Zelda, you're supposed to be so measured and precise, but Hyrule Warriors is just like slash and throw bombs at all the things. That's something you can do. And Resident Evil 3, that hospital siege, is like, hey, you've been conserving your ammo, but like, why don't you just kind of lay into these zombies for a while and expend some of the adrenaline that's built up in you. So I think RE3 is a great game, but I don't think it holds a candle or perhaps a match to The Last of Us 2 or Amnesia Rebirth in this category.
I think the same thing goes for David, like when you talk about, like, it's great that when a game, I can have a shotgun or a submachine gun and still be terrified about what's around the corner. I think that speaks loads to a game like that.
I think
Nemesis,
that's the power.
That's the power thing, yeah. Oh, well, I mean, yeah, like that is the power. Like, you can delay Nemesis. In fact, you are somewhat incentivized to fight him since he drops pickups. It's been a minute, but I don't think you can get it anywhere else. And they're also, like, the hunters can still insta-kill you if you're at, like, yellow health or lower. So, like, you're never that much of a badass that things don't still make you tense up when they appear.
What I was going to say is I think that speaks to the power of horror in that insect part.
Mm-hmm,
is that you find out how they can affect you right off the bat. And once you know that when you go in there, it doesn't matter if you've picked up every bullet in the game up to that point. Once you run out of healing items, you're fucked.
Yeah, like you definitely like avoiding the monsters is that much more crucial because you'll get poisoned and you might like turn the power back on and then like die right at the doorway out because you know the poison overtook you. Yeah, that part of the game might be one of the best areas of the game. Like the lighting is incredible, the music is on point. There's a little bit of body horror with how the chimera infect you and poison you. They're so damn fast and they're able to like skitter around on the walls and the ceiling. So again, like you have some decent firepower, but they're still kind of hard to hit. And you almost don't want to you don't want to burn the ammo because they're so fast.
There's also the fact that the objectives, you don't automatically do them. It takes a few seconds to get the objective done.
And the camera moves so that you can see and hear those bastards like right up behind you, and you're just like, do I let go? Do I turn and fire? Yeah, that part is really well done.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like, I don't know, Asif, if you want to speak to some of the like horror elements in Bug Snacks. I know someone nominated it, and I can kind of see why, but I think we were talking about how it's not really like a horror game, just has a few horror elements.
Yeah, Sam nominated Bug Snacks. It's not a horror game. It has elements of horror. Kind of like Half-Life Alyx, right? It has elements of horror, but it's not a horror game either. But not giving... I don't want to spoil Bug Snacks because it's a very narrative-driven game. But the last 10% of that game, it takes a very...
Maybe one of the biggest left turns that I've seen in a game in a long time.
Yeah. And that's where you could argue that it is a horror game. There's also some other stuff just that's kind of weird that happens before that. But yeah, it's really the ending that I think...
Floofty is a horror game character in a happy game.
Yeah, Floofty is very weird. And you do some very troubling things. That are dark.
Like, she doesn't ask, she tells you to do some very troubling things.
Oh dear.
Yeah, he has a whole contraption built. That scene is hilarious. And that's why I'm like, it's not scary. Even at its most horror-y moments, it's not really scary. You know what I mean? And I think Amnesia Rebirth, I think RE3, a lot of the Last of Us Part 2, a lot of these other games did a very good job of like setting a tone of horror and making the entire environment feel like that. Whereas Bug Snacks is just kind of, there's an element of horror to it.
Yeah. I think one nomination I want to put out there, although I don't think it should win, is Demon Souls. Demon Souls, the first time I played it, I kind of started thinking of it as a sort of spiritual successor to Diablo 1. Diablo 1 was a much darker fantasy game than 2 and 3. It was gothic horror. Demon Souls is dark fantasy, which is another way of saying fantasy horror. The sound design has always... The sound and, I don't know, the audio visuals as a total package have always been pretty great in terms of art direction, not in terms of fidelity in these games. Even in the first game, Asif, there's a level where it gets into like Eldritch or Lovecraftian horror where you're in this castle kind of walking atop these walkways and there's a giant heart that you have to like cut down to pass and get to the boss. And if you like put headphones on, you just hear this boom, 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 boom that gets louder as you approach the heart and go further through the level. I think that game has strong horror elements, whereas Dark Souls, and especially Dark Souls 2 and 3, moved more into epic fantasy, more lush environments, less scary in the way that horror can be scary. But I just kind of wanted to call Demon Souls out because I think that's an aspect of its design that's sometimes overlooked, especially since the Dark Souls games were so much more commercially successful. They're just these juggernauts compared to Demon Souls.
Being uninitiated in Demon Souls and stepping into that first fog doorway where a giant demon just waltzes down the hall and kicks your ass is kind of terrifying.
Yeah, it is. Especially, and there's that recurring terror because even though you know it's coming next time, you kind of get a little sweaty palms knowing that it is coming and how you're going to deal with it. Because just knowing that it's coming is only half the battle. Like, how are you going to kill it? One of my favorite stories from Demon Souls, this is in the original, was I didn't really know back then that you're not supposed to go through that game linearly. Like, after beating 1-1, the game kind of becomes a Mega Man stage select, where I think you put it that way, TJ, maybe in your review. I went right to 1-2, which is you running across these ramparts where a dragon is like chasing you and breathing fire. And like, I remember very distinctly my first time playing that level, I'd wait for the dragon to fly, I'd haul ass after it so that I could get to the safe point, the next safe point before it circled back. I finally made it. I died several times. I like rushed for the fog gate, and then the fight with the Tower Knight boss started. It was kind of an out of the frying pan into the fire moment for me. Yeah, I just think that game does certain types of horror very well that Dark Souls didn't, because Dark Souls is much more epic fantasy inspired than gothic fantasy or horror fantasy.
I mean, we got to bring up Swamp of Sorrow. When you're down in there, I mean, the first moment of horror is when you realize you can't roll or sprint.
Yeah.
The second moment of horror is when you see one of those giant dudes running towards you, ready to club your ass, and you're just like, oh dear.
A little bit of trivia: those guys are the hardest non-boss enemies in the game, and they're dark phantom forms. If you go in there in Black World Tendency, it's just a fucking nightmare. Especially in the original where there was no sodden ring. Like, if you didn't fight those on a flat surface, you were basically fucked. They'd one-shot you no matter what. But yeah, I don't know. I know we don't have a lot of horror players here. I think we might have all of our nominations.
Yeah, I don't have a nomination for this category.
Oh, I have one more. Just a shout out for Greg. Resident Evil 2 Remake. But that was last year.
Wait.
Yeah, no.
Game of the year every year.
I saw someone mention Carrion. Has anyone mentioned
Carrion? Who nominated that? That's.
I didn't, but I would argue that's.
I'm not scared when I play that game.
Metroidvania.
It's
more of a Metroidvania than it is a horror game, right?
It's
has
horror
elements.
themed,
Yeah.
but
Horror themed, yeah.
It's got a horror like aesthetic to it, but it's
if
not
you're scared
really
of Carrion, then I'm gonna tell you something. That's not fear. That's guilt. That's guilt for being the monster and doing all those things.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's vote then.
TJ really swayed me with his argument for Amnesia Rebirth. I'm looking forward to getting deeper into that game. So yeah, Amnesia for me.
Okay.
That series is just incredible. That whole series, Amnesia, just
it is.
They're constantly outdoing themselves, and I'm gonna give it my vote.
Okay.
I'm a little scaredy cat, and I don't play scary games, so I trust the tastes of people like David Craddock and TJ Denzer. So I am going to vote for Amnesia as well.
Okay.
I remember playing through the first Amnesia and just the level of fear that the game instills in you, just like not even like seeing the monster, but just that's that level of anxiety that's just forced upon you because of the environment, the sounds and everything. And as much as I love The Last of Us 2 and as much as I love the horror sequences in that, I just don't think it's a full-on horror game. I don't think it deserves this reward. So I'm gonna have to side with TJ and M on Amnesia Rebirth.
I think not for nothing, but Amnesia came out in 2010, which was when YouTube was really gaining steam. And I feel like the reactions to areas of that game, like the water monster, was maybe one of the first moments in games where like reaction videos really became a thing.
I mean, Amnesia: The Dark Descent made PewDiePie. Like it made one of
that's right. Yeah, that's right.
Planet.
That's right. I forgot that. Yeah.
Are we arguing against Amnesia? That sounds like an argument.
Yeah, that might be an argument against Amnesia.
Okay.
But no, like yeah, it really reaction videos kind of took off with that.
So Donovan voted for RE3.
I think he said he's never really played a lot of horror games though, so if that was his main exposure.
You remember that he just turned 21 and got wasted and then couldn't show up today, so he was probably drunk when he did it.
Yeah. And then Sam voted for Bugsnax.
All right. Well, there you go.
Chris.
I would have I'm gonna go with TJ's, but I want to say this out loud that I think rules are for losers, and I hate that we have rules because otherwise I would have voted for Phasmophobia.
I like that game a lot.
I
I
could have
do.
agreed
Yes.
on Phasmo if it wasn't
You
early
know,
access.
You're right, Krabs. We should just give fucking Game of the Year to Rocket League every year. It's. I get your point. You make a really good point. We should vote for.
But yeah,
Snowflake.
in this category, Amnesia. Just letting it be on the record that I was, standing for the Phas.
Yeah, no. Look, there.
I think there's a really good chance
for.
Phasmophobia gets this next year.
Yeah, it can win this next year when it's eligible. It could win Best Early Access Game this year if you get enough people to vote for it. So
Yeah,
That I'm going to preface this by saying that early access category is going to be a train wreck
I
because
know.
there's so many good eligible games.
but that's where
That's
that
it.
game is eligible. Bill?
You know what? I really normally I would be pretty much everything The Last of Us, but the way that TJ described the horror, I'm more into horror games that kind of get the big picture. Like they don't force feed it to you, but they just create something that's just naturally creepy and scary and terrifying, as indirectly as directly. So I'm gonna go with Amnesia.
Oh wait.
Steve?
I think TJ sold me on Amnesia, so I'm gonna go with Amnesia.
Greg?
I was gonna do Resident Evil 3, but TJ's argument and me watching this gameplay where this thing is stalking you from Amnesia is very reminiscent of Alien Isolation. So I'm gonna go with Amnesia because that game looks much more terrifying.
It's called Amnesia Rebirth, right?
Mhm.
Okay. Yeah, I thought TJ made a really good case for it. I've watched some gameplay of this game. I haven't had a chance to play it. There were definitely some threads on Chatty about it when it launched too. I know Borzoi really liked it, and she's kind of a horror game aficionado.
She is.
Yeah, I think Amnesia Rebirth kind of seems like the runaway here. Because RE3 is just not as scary as RE2 to me.
It definitely has its moments, but you're much more powerful overall, and you kind of have to be as things escalate between Jill and Nemesis. But yeah, like even though there are times when you have this badass arsenal, but you're still scared, it just doesn't hold a candle to these other games that kind of like pump horror directly into your veins.
Like I do think the hospital scene, I can't remember the guy's name.
Carlos. Yeah.
Carlos's hospital scene is like a great example of RE being a horror game. But if it was just the hospital scene the whole time, that might be my horror game of the year. But
going between the hospital and the nest with all the bugs, that's the game. Like, oh fuck. Yeah.
You know where
that was it. Like that would be pretty damn terrifying.
Yeah.
Do you know where anything involving Carlos loses its horror element with me? The fact that he has a straight punch that can straight up fucking kill anything in the game.
It's strong. You do have to do a lot of damage, especially to like hunters, for that to work. But like, I get where you're coming from.
Well, it looks like we have a pretty overwhelming vote here. RE3 got 1 vote, Bugsnax got 1 vote, and then 10 votes went to Amnesia Rebirth. So Amnesia Rebirth, you are the Shacknews best horror game of 2020.
Ah!